This is a rack of Mikuni vacuum actuated carburetors, and today I'm going to walk you through everything I know about them. Not all vacuum actuated carbs are going to be exactly the same, but they do tend to share a lot of similarities, and once you know what the parts are, you'll begin to recognize them in spite of the differences. First, a quick walk around the exterior of the set. This is the intake side, where air from the airbox is sucked in to be mixed with vaporized fuel on its way through to the combustion chamber for ignition. The largest opening, here, comes into play when you're on throttle and higher quantities of air are needed. The cone shape of this opening makes use of the Venturi effect to accelerate the air, and at wide open throttle, the carb body is basically acting as a large jet. In addition to this large opening, there are several smaller openings that have different roles. The narrow slot at the top of the inlet allows air into the upper chamber. The faster the engine's spinning, the more air is being blown through this hole, which pushes up the diaphragm located under the carb cap, and this raises the slide. Along the bottom are two small air jets. One runs straight to the needle jet, and I presume it's acting to help atomize the fuel being drawn through it. The other runs to the pilot jet and has a similar role. The other things we can see here are the idle speed adjuster, the upper carb rail, the upper and lower rails hold the rack together, the float bowls, and the fuel supply hoses. On the engine or combustion side, the primary thing to note are the butterflies. When you twist the throttle, it pulls the cable which rotates the shafts the butterflies are mounted to. Each carb has its own shaft with the linkage at the end that has a balancing screw, so you can get all four carbs doing the same thing at the same time. Balancing refers to adjusting the vacuum pressure across all four carbs so that they're all equal. These caps cover ports for attaching a manometer, the tool used to measure the vacuum pressure, and the difference from one carb to the next. Another thing you can see here is the choke rail. Choke is in quotes because while it's a commonly accepted term, it would be more accurate to call it an enrichment circuit. The rail has little forks that pull plungers and open a path for more fuel to be supplied when starting a cold engine. Some other things to note here. This vacuum line sucks back a little diaphragm in the petcock to allow fuel to flow when the bike is running and acts as an auto stop when it's not. We see the carb caps again, the lower carb rail. We get just a peek of the fuel transfer line to the enrichment circuit, the clip where the choke cable attaches, and a float bowl drain screw. On the bottom of the carbs, the most important thing to note is the idle air screw. Often these are preset and capped from the factory, so if you need to adjust or clean them, you'll have to drill out the cap. These appear to have been previously drilled out. The other components down here we've seen before, the float bowls with their drain screws, the idle speed adjustment screw, and the lower carb rail. On top, we see the carb caps, the vacuum ports, the throttle cable clip, the vacuum line to the petcock, the fuel supply hoses, and one of the choke fuel transfer lines. So let's get into them. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the petcock vacuum line and the fuel supply hoses. Next, I'll take off the carb caps and remove the slide assemblies. This has the diaphragm, slide, and the needle. On this style of cap, keep an eye out for the small O-ring at the vacuum port. These are easy to miss, drop, and lose if they stick to the cap. I'm working on all four carbs at the same time, but if you're unfamiliar with carb work, it's a good idea to do them one at a time so you can reference the others if needed. Next, I'm removing the float bowls. In these carbs, the floats and needle valve pop out as a single assembly, but on a lot of older bikes, there are legs cast directly as part of the carb body. These have a pin that needs to be tapped or pushed out to remove the floats and access the needle valve. As fuel comes in here, it fills up the bowl, causing the float to rise up and lift the needle into a seat, cutting off the fuel flow to prevent overfilling. This assembly also has a straw for the enrichment circuit with another little jet at one end. Again, watch for little parts while working. These carbs have small rubber caps over the idle jet hole. 2 of them stayed in place, but 2 have apparently fallen when I took out the floats. Easy to lose little bits like this if you're not careful. Now I'll pull out the jets. First is the main jet, and then the idle jet. Third is the idle air jet. As mentioned previously, these are often sealed. Typically, before you remove them, you want to screw them all the way in, counting the turns, until they are gently seated, and make note of that setting. I had done that previously on this set, and they were set at 3 3/4 turns out, which is massively out of line with my previous experience. Typically, they are 1 3/4 to 2.5 turns out. It's for this reason and the fact that the manual calls them preset on the US model that I believe they've been previously drilled out and changed. When you take them out, make sure you get all the parts. In addition to the needle-shaped screw, there is a spring, a tiny washer, and a tiny O-ring, and these usually need to be fished out with a pick. Now, I'll push out the needle jets. On these carbs, the slide guides are replaceable, but often they are integral to the carb body. When there are removable guides like this, watch again for O-rings. They may stick to the slide guide or the carb body, and if you're not paying attention, once again, they're easy to lose. Then I'll take off the choke rail. I was going to pop off all the choke valves, but I came to realize there isn't enough clearance to do so unless the carbs are separated from their rails, which I try really hard to avoid, as these screws tend to be locked in pretty solid, and they always seem to strip out for me. The assembly has a spring-loaded plunger with a barrel. The end of the barrel has a rubber gasket that keeps the passage closed unless the choke is engaged at startup. With the needle valve out, hold it up to a bright light or put one behind it to make sure all the little passages are clear. Do this with the jets as well. The main jet is pretty easy to see, and the idle jet is much smaller and a little trickier. If these aren't open, you can use a very small gauge wire to gently clear them. I have a homemade tool fashioned from a piece of piano wire. While looking at the jets with the light, something caught my eye. If you've been following my Katana project, you know I've had an issue with cylinders 2 and 3 running cooler than 1 and 4. I had been told when I got the bike that the carbs had recently been balanced, but if this was done, it was clearly not done correctly. You can see by the amount of light getting around 1 and 4 that they are slightly open, while 2 and 3 are completely closed. I believe this to be a logical explanation for 1 and 4 running hotter than 2 and 3. 1 and 4 running with a throttle position that was partially open, while 2 and 3, being fully closed, were being pulled along while getting a smaller fuel load and not contributing to the work. Using the light, I adjusted the balance screws so all 4 butterflies closed at approximately the same time. I'll need to fine-tune the balance with a manometer when it's back together, but this should get it a lot closer. Before I put the carbs back together, let's have a look at the internal parts of the carb body. At the top, we can see the vacuum passage, the choke passage closed, the choke passage open, the groove for the diaphragm lip, the upper chamber air inlet, and the slot the slide guide fits into. On the bottom, we see the main jet hole. The main jet screws into the bottom of the needle jet, the idle jet hole, the fuel inlet, the needle valve and seat portion of the float assembly plug in here, the choke straw, which draws fuel up to the valve we saw at the top, the vent hole and vent at the top of the fuel chamber, the air idle screw hole, and these three little holes or perforations that let a little bit more air and fuel flow as the butterflies start to open. You can just see the brass color of the butterfly closing off the frontmost of these holes here. On the engine side of the butterflies, you can see this tiny hole. This is the opening controlled by the air idle screw. Notice that the three perforations are completely covered by the butterfly. As the butterfly starts to open, they're exposed and allow the extra air-fuel mixture to be sucked through. And here is an array of all the bits removed from one of the carb bodies. When people are tuning carbs, assuming they're all balanced, they are typically adjusting three things: the main jet size, the idle air screw position, and the needle clip position. I understand enough of the principles involved that I've made small adjustments when I felt it was necessary in the past, but I'm not a carb guru, so I typically try to keep it all at the stock settings. So let's start putting it back together. Having already put in the drain screw in the float bowl, I fit the new bowl gasket. Put the O-ring on the slide guide. Reassemble the choke assembly. Put the spacer and spring seat back on the needle and fit them into the slide. This is a little tricky to align sometimes. Then I reassemble the needle valve and float and replace the O-rings where they fit into the carb body. I put the vacuum port cap back on. And then I put the idle air needle assembly together. Now I push the slide guide into the carb body followed by the needle jet. Note, the needle jet goes in a certain way, so look for a flat spot or a slot on the jet and the alignment pin in the bore. With the needle jet in, it is secured with the main jet. Then the idle jet is screwed in and its rubber cap placed. Then the float assembly is slipped into place. And the float bowl screwed down. The last thing to do on the bottom is to put the air idle screw back. Screw it all the way to the bottom until it's gently seated, and then back it out the desired number of turns. I was going to set them at 1 3/4 out, but after a bit more research, decided on 2 full turns, so I added another 1/4 turn after this video was shot. On the top, we slip the needle and slide down into the slide guide, making sure the needle is going into the needle jet. Sometimes the diaphragm can be tricky, and it doesn't want to stay seated. Here I was trying to get it to relax into the groove. After a break to set the vacuum port O-ring and another attempt, I grabbed my heat gun to gently warm it. The thermal expansion helped it to sit better, and I was able to install the spring and cap. Don't rush this. Take your time and make sure it's seated. Otherwise, you can pinch or tear the thin rubber of the diaphragm when tightening the cap. Then I clipped in the choke assembly. And with all four of them in place, the choke rail was refitted. The forks fit into the grooves on the shaft, and then it's just clipped into place. And that is the carbs back together. I'm looking forward to getting these back on the Katana and hoping I have all four cylinders running at similar temps now. Thanks for watching.